Alberta is the only reason Canada works. That's not an opinion, that's math. 84% of Canada's oil comes from Alberta, 20% of the entire Canadian economy, $32 billion a year flowing to Ottawa. Now imagine that stops. Imagine Alberta votes yes. 52% choose independence. The referendum passes. The separation begins. What happens to Canada the next morning? The Canadian dollar collapses before the results are even certified. 9% down before noon, 13% by market close. Quebec wakes up $13 billion poorer. The transfer payments that funded their healthcare, their schools, their entire social safety net, gone overnight. The Maritimes? They're on the phone with Ottawa begging for emergency funds. But Ottawa doesn't have emergency funds. Ottawa just lost 20% of its revenue. And here's the part that should terrify every Canadian watching. It doesn't stop with Alberta. Saskatchewan is watching. British Columbia is divided. And by the time Ottawa figures out how to respond, they might not have a country left to save. This is not speculation. The petition is live right now. Signatures are being collected across Alberta. The deadline is May 2nd. The referendum is October. Let me show you exactly what Canada looks like without Alberta, and why what's left might not survive the decade. Day 1. The market's open. Currency traders don't wait for speeches. They don't wait for official statements. They see the referendum results and they do math. Alberta gone means 20% of GDP gone. Alberta gone means energy exports crippled. Alberta gone means federal debt obligations concentrated on fewer provinces with less capacity to pay. So they sell. They sell everything with Canadian exposure. The Bank of Canada calls an emergency meeting by 9 a.m. Governor Tiff Macklem faces two options. Raise interest rates to defend the dollar, which will crush borrowing and trigger a recession. Or let the dollar fall, which will spike inflation and make every import unaffordable. He raises rates. It's the wrong choice, but there are no right choices anymore. By Friday, the Canadian dollar settles around 61 cents against the US dollar. That's a 20% decline from pre-referendum levels. Everything Canadians import now costs 20% more. Gas, food, electronics, medicine, 20% more expensive overnight. But here's what I need you to understand. The currency crash isn't the crisis. It's just the warning shot. The real crisis hits 48 hours later when the accountants finish their calculations. Let me show you a number the federal government has been hiding for decades. A number that explains why Ottawa will do anything, to keep Alberta from leaving. Every year, the Canadian government collects taxes from all provinces and redistributes them through a system called equalization. Provinces that generate more than they need send money to Ottawa. Provinces that can't cover their own expenses receive money from Ottawa. In theory, this balances the federation. In practice, it means one province has been funding everyone else for 50 years, Alberta. In 2015, Alberta's net contribution to federal coffers was $27 billion. By 2025, that number grew to $32 billion. That's $32 billion more than Alberta received back in services, every single year. Where does that money go? Quebec receives approximately $13 billion annually in equalization payments. $13 billion. That's almost 10% of Quebec's entire provincial budget funded by a province 2,000 kilometers away. The Maritimes collectively receive another $8 billion. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland. These provinces literally cannot function without transfer payments. Manitoba receives $3 billion. Even Ontario, supposedly the economic engine of Eastern Canada, has become a net recipient in recent years. Now imagine all that money disappears. Not gradually, not over time, overnight. This is the part nobody in Ottawa wants to talk about. Because the moment you see these numbers, you understand why they're so desperate to keep Alberta in Confederation. It's not about national unity. It's not about shared values. It's about survival. Without Alberta's money, Quebec faces a $13 billion budget hole. Think about what that means. 10% of your provincial budget gone. Hospitals close, schools cut staff, infrastructure projects canceled, welfare payments reduced. Quebec's unions call a general strike within 2 weeks of Alberta's exit. Montreal sees protests that make the 2012 student demonstrations look like a picnic. The provincial government teeters. But here's what's worse. Quebec isn't even the hardest hit. Per capita, the Maritime provinces depend on federal transfers more than any other region in Canada. New Brunswick receives roughly $4,000 per person in equalization. Nova Scotia is similar. Prince Edward Island even higher. When that money vanishes, these provinces don't face austerity. They face insolvency. Within 18 months of Alberta's exit, at least one Maritime province will require federal bailout intervention. The problem? The federal government is broke too. This is what I mean when I say collapse pattern. It's not one thing breaking. It's everything breaking at once, each failure accelerating the next. Alberta leaves. Revenue drops. The dollar crashes. Borrowing costs spike. Credit ratings fall, more borrowing costs, less investment, less tax revenue, more borrowing. The spiral accelerates until something breaks completely. But I haven't even shown you the worst part yet, because everything I just described assumes the damage is only financial. It's not. The strategic damage is even more severe. Let me show you the map Ottawa doesn't want you to see. The real resource map of Canada. When politicians talk about Canada, they talk about shared values, multiculturalism, universal healthcare, polite people in cold winters. They don't talk about this. 84% of Canada's oil production comes from Alberta. Another 12% comes from Saskatchewan. That's 96% of Canadian oil concentrated in 2 provinces. When Alberta leaves, Canada loses 84% of its oil overnight. If Saskatchewan follows, and I'll explain why that's increasingly likely, Canada loses 96%. What's left is a country that produces almost no energy, a country completely dependent on imports, a country with no leverage in any negotiation about anything. Potash. This is the fertilizer that feeds the world. Without potash, crop yields collapse, food prices spike, people go hungry. Saskatchewan has the largest potash reserves on Earth. Not the largest in Canada, the largest on the planet, more than Russia, more than Belarus. When farmers in Brazil and India and China need fertilizer, they buy it from Saskatchewan. If Saskatchewan leaves, Canada goes from agricultural superpower to agricultural irrelevance in a single vote. Uranium. Canada is the second largest uranium producer in the world, the fuel for nuclear reactors, the foundation of clean energy, the strategic resource that every major power is scrambling to secure. Guess where it comes from? Saskatchewan's Athabasca Basin, the highest grade uranium deposits ever discovered on Earth. If Saskatchewan leaves, Canada loses its seat at the table in every conversation about global energy. Now look at what's left. Ontario has manufacturing and financial services. Quebec has hydroelectric power. The Maritimes have fishing and tourism. That's it. That's the Eastern Canadian economy. Factories that depend on energy they no longer produce. Banks that manage a currency that's collapsing. Fish and tourists. Against this backdrop, ask yourself a simple question. Why would Saskatchewan stay? They share every single grievance Alberta has. The equalization formula that bleeds them dry. The federal regulations that strangle their energy sector. The Ottawa elites who lecture them about carbon emissions while cashing checks written with oil money. Saskatchewan has been watching Alberta's independence movement with intense interest. Premier Scott Moe has challenged Ottawa on jurisdiction for years. He's asserted provincial control over natural resources. He's fought the carbon tax all the way to the Supreme Court. And now Alberta just proved that leaving is possible. The petition process works. The legal framework exists. The public anger is real. All Saskatchewan needs is a spark. Alberta's referendum is that spark. Within 6 months of Alberta's exit, Saskatchewan's independence movement goes mainstream. 45% support separation in early polling. Not a majority yet, but momentum matters more than margins. And if Saskatchewan goes, what holds British Columbia together? Vancouver is liberal, urban, connected to Asian markets. The interior is conservative, rural, connected to Alberta. These 2 regions have been arguing about separation from each other for decades. If Alberta and Saskatchewan are both gone, northern BC has no reason to stay attached to Vancouver. The Peace River region, the Okanagan, the resource-rich interior, they'll start asking questions Ottawa cannot answer. 1 province leaving is a crisis. 2 provinces leaving is a catastrophe. 3 regions fragmenting is the end of Canada as a unified nation. Next, I'll show you exactly how this domino effect unfolds. Which provinces follow Alberta out the door, which provinces are left holding the debt, and what the map of North America looks like when the collapse is complete. Because this isn't about one referendum anymore. This is about a country discovering that the thing holding it together was never shared values. It was Alberta's money. And in 75 days, that money might be gone forever. So Alberta is gone. The referendum passed. The separation is happening. Now let me show you what comes next. Because what I'm about to describe isn't speculation. It's the logical outcome of forces already in motion. And it ends with a map of North America that looks nothing like the one you learned in school. The morning after Alberta's referendum, every premier in Western Canada holds an emergency meeting with their staff. They're all asking the same question. Are we next? In Saskatchewan, Premier Scott Moe watches the results come in. He congratulates Alberta publicly. He says Saskatchewan respects their democratic choice. He says nothing about what Saskatchewan will do. But everyone knows what's coming. Saskatchewan has the same grievances, the same resources, the same resentment of Ottawa, the same feeling that they send billions east and get nothing but lectures in return. I'll tell you exactly what Saskatchewan does in my next video, because that story deserves its own deep dive. But understand this, the pressure starts building the moment Alberta's results are certified. Saskatchewan is watching, and they're taking notes. For now, let's focus on what happens to the Canada that remains, because the damage starts immediately. British Columbia cracks first. BC isn't like other provinces. It's two completely different regions forced to share a government. And Alberta's exit exposes that fracture in ways that can't be repaired. Coastal BC is urban, liberal, environmentalist. Vancouver, Victoria, the Lower Mainland. These areas vote with Toronto and Montreal. They oppose pipelines. They support carbon taxes. They celebrated when Ottawa blocked Alberta's energy projects. Interior BC is rural, conservative, resource dependent. The Peace River region, the Okanagan, the Kootenays, Prince George, Fort St. John. These communities have more in common with Calgary than with Vancouver. They wanted those pipelines. They needed those energy jobs. For decades, the coast outvoted the interior. Vancouver's population dominated provincial politics. The interior grumbled, but accepted it. Not anymore. Within weeks of Alberta's exit, a movement emerges in northern BC. They call themselves Free BC. Their proposal is simple. Split British Columbia in two. Let the coast keep Vancouver and Victoria. Let the interior form their own province or join Alberta. The movement gains traction faster than anyone expected. Because here's what coastal politicians never understood. Interior BC has the resources, the natural gas fields, the timber, the minerals, the hydroelectric potential, the agricultural land. The coast has condos and tech startups and yoga studios. If the interior separates, coastal BC becomes a narrow strip of expensive real estate with no energy, no resources, and no economic engine. They'd be completely dependent on imports from regions that resent them. By 2028, Free BC collects enough signatures to force a provincial referendum on splitting British Columbia. The vote is close. 52% choose to remain unified, but 48% voted to tear the province apart. That's not a victory for Ottawa. That's a warning. Nearly half of British Columbia wants out, and that number grows every single year. Now let's talk about what happens in the East. The immediate crisis is financial. Within 72 hours of Alberta's exit, the federal government faces a fiscal emergency unlike anything in Canadian history. The math is brutal. Canada's federal debt stands at approximately $1.2 trillion. When Alberta leaves, that debt doesn't leave with them. The remaining provinces inherit the full obligation, but they inherit it with 20% less economic capacity, 20% less tax revenue, 20% less ability to service what they owe. The debt-to-GDP ratio explodes overnight. Before Alberta's exit, it was around 100%. After, it spikes to 125%, and it keeps climbing. Credit rating agencies act within weeks. Canada drops from AAA to AA, then from AA to A. Each downgrade increases borrowing costs. Each increase in borrowing costs expands the deficit. Each expanded deficit triggers another downgrade. This is the death spiral. Once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop. Within 3 years, Canada's credit rating falls to BBB. That's one step above junk. The interest payments on federal debt consume an ever larger share of the budget. There's no money for healthcare improvements, no money for infrastructure, no money for the transfer payments that kept the Maritimes functioning. And that brings us to Quebec. The Parti Québécois has been waiting for this moment for 50 years. 2 independence referendums failed, 1980, 1995. Both times, Quebecers decided the economic risks were too high. Better to stay in a stable, prosperous Canada than gamble on going alone. But this Canada isn't stable anymore. This Canada isn't prosperous. This Canada is bleeding money, bleeding credibility, bleeding provinces. The economic argument for staying just disappeared. In 2029, the Parti Québécois wins the provincial election on a sovereignty platform. Premier Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon announces a third independence referendum. The campaign is different this time. The Federalists can't promise stability because there is no stability. They can't promise prosperity because the economy is contracting. They can't promise Canada will protect Quebec's interests because Canada can barely protect itself. On referendum night, Quebec votes 56% for independence. Now look at what's left. Ontario, population 14 million, the largest remaining province. But Ontario's economy depends on manufacturing and financial services, both in terminal decline. The auto plants are relocating, not because of politics, because of math. American states offer cheaper energy, lower taxes, and direct access to the world's largest consumer market. Why would any manufacturer stay in Ontario when they can move to Michigan or Ohio and cut costs by 30%? The banks are struggling too. A collapsing currency means deposits fleeing to safer havens. A contracting economy means fewer loans, fewer mortgages, fewer fees. Bay Street isn't dying, but it's shrinking, and shrinking fast. The Maritimes face something worse than decline. They face irrelevance. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, combined population of 2.5 million. Economies based on fishing, tourism, and federal transfers. The transfers are gone. Ottawa doesn't have money to transfer. The tourists are going elsewhere. Why visit a depressed region of a collapsing country when you can visit Maine or Florida? The fishing industry alone cannot support 4 provinces. Within 5 years of Alberta's exit, the Maritime provinces face a choice. Dramatic consolidation, merging into 1 or 2 provinces to cut administrative costs, or economic collapse and depopulation as young people flee to wherever the jobs are. Manitoba is caught in the middle, geographically between a vanished west and a struggling east. Premier Wab Kinew watches Saskatchewan carefully. If Saskatchewan follows Alberta, Manitoba becomes an orphan, cut off from Western markets, too small to matter in the East, dependent on American goodwill for any trade access at all. And here's the final piece of this puzzle. The United States isn't watching this collapse with concern. They're watching it with interest. As Alberta negotiates its independence, they need trading partners. They need financial systems. They need security guarantees. And there's only one country positioned to provide all 3. Alberta's separation deal includes preferential trade access to American markets. Their oil flows south without tariffs. Their goods move freely across the border. In exchange, Alberta aligns its regulations with American standards and opens its resource sector to American investment. It's not annexation, it's integration. Alberta remains technically independent, but economically they become an extension of the American system. Quebec negotiates a similar arrangement. They position themselves as a bridge between America and Europe. Sovereign in name, aligned in practice, the provinces left in Canada, Ontario, the Maritimes, Manitoba, find themselves isolated. Their largest trading partner is the United States. Their former fellow provinces now have better American access than they do. Within a decade, what remains of Canada faces an impossible choice. Continue as an independent nation with a shrinking economy and crushing debts, or negotiate their own integration with the American system, surrendering sovereignty piece by piece in exchange for survival. This is what collapse looks like. Not a single dramatic moment, a cascade, each fracture weakening the structure, each weakness enabling the next fracture, until something that seemed permanent reveals itself as temporary. Canada wasn't held together by shared values. It wasn't held together by the Constitution or bilingualism or peacekeeping mythology. It was held together by money, Alberta's money, and now that money's gone. 75 days, that's how long until the petition deadline, May 2nd, 2026. If the Alberta Prosperity Project collects 177,000 signatures, the referendum happens in October. And if that referendum passes, everything I just described becomes inevitable. But there's one piece of this story I haven't told you yet. One province that's been watching from the sidelines, the one with the potash, the uranium, the oil, and every reason to follow Alberta out the door. Saskatchewan, they're next, and that story is coming soon.